I'm Brett Collier. I'm a professor of wildlife biology at Louisiana State University.
Jason Lapardis, work for Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm a wildlife biologist, and today we're going to hit on a little bit about feeding wildlife, especially the wild turkey. All right, Brett, we have kind of a hot topic today to talk about, and it's feeding wildlife, or really specifically wild turkeys. And what does this mean? I mean, there's a lot of folks, they want to help turkeys, and we talk about habitat and all their needs, and some folks think they really just have to have more feed on the ground or in a feeder for birds.
Yes,
and is that the case? And I think I'm gonna lay this out. You know, if we look across America, and I'm going to admit I'm one of those guys, I got a bird feeder out back, and I feed every now and then, but I'm known to go out there and clean it out. I like to move it around. I don't want it to have it in the same place, and there's some things I can do to try to help those little songbirds that we like to watch off the back porch. You know, especially certain times of the year when we got some really harsh weather, that I like to put a little something else out there for them. And so I know there's a lot of people out there that have a ton of questions about, you know, impacts of trying to put food out, especially the most common one found. You can go to any market, any store, you name it, and there's going to be a big old pile of what we call yellow acorns, or we call it corn, okay? That's going to be put out specifically for turkey, deer, you name it. And what do you think is impacting birds with that? And I'm going to hit on one specific one, and then we'll hit on some things in general. But, you know, it's something I think it's been a hot topic over the last 10 years with impacts on quail, impacts on waterfowl. And a lot of people have been curious, like, are there impacts with certain types of aflatoxins or an aflatoxin on turkeys from corn? Tell us what you know and what we can try to get out there to everyone that may have some feed on the ground.
So feeding wildlife, just broadly speaking, society's transitioned over the last 50 to 100 years where we feed wildlife for a lot of different reasons. I have bird feeders out in front of my house. You know, black oil sunflower seeds is what we use because I like to see the little tufted titmice. You know, the juncos, dark-eyed juncos and all them that come to the house. And I've got my little woodpecker blocks that I put out.
You got the suet.
Try and put the jelly out for the orioles in the spring. So the backyard birding community is, you can go buy your feeder at your local store and have it full, and cleaning it out's a good idea. You know, there are some diseases that birds are going to transmit. There's diseases that finches get in their eyes and that kind of stuff. For wildlife, it's a little different. Generally speaking, across wildlife, we have predominantly focused most of our feeding effort on ungulates, right? On deer. Deer and elk. There's a lot of times in harsh winters, especially out west, in certain areas where there's just not enough food, there has been supplemental feeding done for elk. They dump a bunch of hay and everything out. It's been less for your game birds, generally speaking. Probably most of the food that's put on the ground for game birds, quail, I think you referenced earlier, is strewn on roads, or put out on, especially in Texas, they run the feeder and that kind of stuff, or it's put in some sort of a container on the landscape, deer feeder that quail and turkeys will also eat at. So backing up on this idea of adding food to the landscape, I'm neither pro nor con. What I think about it is that we put food on the landscape, generally speaking, to aggregate animals someplace that we want them to be so we can harvest them.
Sometimes it's beyond harvest. We just want to get a pretty picture.
Sometimes it's a picture, not a problem. But a lot for deer feeders, we put a feeder out there because in some places you wouldn't see a deer without a feeder. I've hunted there. In other reasons, people put it out as to try and support higher density of critters that might be able to exist on the landscape. Also does occur. I don't think for turkeys, and I'm going to be very specific to turkeys here, I don't think for turkeys that we have a problem with food on the landscape. And I say that in that rarely do we see any sort of starvation-related die-offs of birds on the landscape, especially in the southern United States and central United States. Now, I will caveat this by saying up north, when you get Maine, Ontario, Michigan,
Minnesota,
Wisconsin, yes,
yep.
maybe some in the plains areas, big snowstorms, lack of access to ground, so the birds can't scratch, and they end up picking off of the fir trees, and that can have negative impacts on the birds.
Right.
But we don't see big starvation, like just die-offs where just birds just dead everywhere. Now, the only time in all of my career, have seen a starved turkey was during the flooding of the Chafalaya Basin when they had to open the Morganza Spillway in Louisiana in 2010, I think it was. Okay,
Right.
The birds were stranded in the middle of the Chafalaya, and there's 20 feet of water, and the ones that were near the edge were able to get out. The ones that were in the middle worked tree to tree to try and get to the high spots they knew were on the landscape, because we were able to show that, but there was no high spots because it was still under 10 or 12 feet of water, and they starved to death because they were out there for about 25 days. But I think that generally speaking, starvation is not a acute.
It's not a major factor that
Right.
we have to be concerned about.
Right. It does
across
occur.
the nation. It does
Does
occur.
occur. Yeah.
And then if there's chances where if some birds may have gotten disease or
Yes.
weakened,
Weakened.
then all of a sudden starvation may come in when they get lethargic. They're not wanting to eat.
Not able to forage,
Very
yes.
similar to other species.
Easier to be predated on or something like that.
But
Right.
overall, having feed out is usually something we don't have to do to make sure we
Right.
have vibrant turkey populations.
Yes, and there are a lot of places that don't feed that have a lot of turkeys all over them. There are other places that do that have a lot of turkeys all over them. To go to your aflatoxin question, because that's been a really
It's a hot topic.
It's a hot topic right now. The broad answer to your question is no. The broad answer to your question is that aflatoxins don't have acute impacts on turkeys. And the first message you're going to get is from someone who says, well, what about all the domestic birds that die?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So
give us this big word.
big
It's going to
fancy
scare
words.
you. I hope you sit down, look it up.
So aflatoxin. No, I'm not even going to say it because you're making fun of me. So aflatoxins, it grows with the corn, and there's been a lot of work that shows that it can reach pretty high levels in feeders or bait piles out on the landscape. And the concern is that turkeys are going and they're eating the corn and they're increasing the level of toxicity in their system. Okay,
absolutely.
So that's the big issue we're dealing with here. There's been a good bit of experimental work done with aflatoxins where they have
This is Mississippi?
not just studies in general, right? Yeah. Looking at like Journal of Wildlife Disease Studies where they have challenged turkey poults with aflatoxin corn, like laced corn, and at different levels of lacing. I think it was like 0 for control, and then like 100 and 200 and 400 parts per million or something like that. And what they found is if the only thing on the landscape, like in these pens, is corn that's super moldy and aflatoxin-y, which has a bad taste and has it's not good for them, then the poults will lose weight, but they don't die. They lose weight. And they show some liver deficiencies because it's your liver, the poult's liver is what's being used to push it out.
So it's not good.
Not good, okay? But it doesn't kill them.
Doesn't kill them.
But in domestic birds, it kills them, and it kills them really, really quickly. Aflatoxin can wreak havoc on domestics, and the reason is that wild turkeys have a thing called GST. That
Tell us what GST is.
I can't even pronounce it.
No,
It's
you
like-
got to say it now. We've talked
It's
about
like
it.
glutamine. What is the S? Specio trans something. And
Okay,
it's a
GST.
I can look it up. We're gonna call it GST.
GST, we're good with that.
And basically, what it is it's the antioxidant that helps flush the toxin out of their system. Wild turkeys have a genetic affinity. They have it. Domestic birds don't. I don't know if it's been bred out or if it doesn't exist in as much. So wild birds are able to flush the aflatoxin, the toxin part of it, out of their, I think it's AFB -1, like inverse 1, flush
Sure.
it out of their system, out through their liver, much more efficiently than your domestic birds can. So the problem with aflatoxin, the studies on it is that the challenges are done. So aflatoxin is a problem.
It is a problem. And I want to
yeah.
go back to what you said. This is really important. We know it's not directly killing birds. However, this is very important. We have wild birds. They're trying to make a living, and everything out there is trying to eat them.
Yes.
And it's sometimes including us, right? And so now we have these weakened birds that are trying to get around, and you may have some cumulative effects in the environment that could be impactful on these birds.
It could be, right?
It could be.
Yeah, and the studies, the challenges that are done are always done on poults.
Right.
They're always done on poults because they're easy to maintain and they're little and that kind of stuff. Aflatoxin on the landscape exists in kernels of corn, right? And turkeys, as they move through the landscape, we all know they're going to hit a feeder and peck a little bit of corn and move on. But that's not all they're eating that day.
That's right.
They're eating a whole
eating
different
bugs and everything
bugs
else.
and plant matter and all kind, maybe a lizard, whatever they come across, right? They're eating all kinds of other stuff. All the studies that have been done showing effects of aflatoxin have been strictly focused on they're only allowed to eat things that have aflatoxin pumped into them. So when they show those effects, those aren't real effects in a natural setting. They're also done at the poult level, not the adult male level, which we're talking about, 18 to 20, pounds of difference, right? In size, the shunting rate, the defecation rates are larger or faster for adults. They can eat more quicker.
Right.
So the potential for cumulative effects is real. It's unknown because we don't think that aflatoxins are a problem.
Right.
Because we never see just turkeys dead on the landscape like we do with waterfowl, avian cholera.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
when you get an avian cholera event for ducks and all the ducks die and you have a big pool of water and it's full of dead ducks. I have been a turkey biologist for over 20 years now. I've never seen turkeys just dead.
Right. Right.
It just does not happen. And people are like, oh, well, they got eaten after they died. It's like, why didn't the ducks get eaten, sort of thing, right? So there potentially could be, because I'm a scientist and I can't say never.
It may.
There potentially could be some latent effects.
That's right.
With aflatoxin that have cumulative longer-term impacts on survival, cumulative longer-term impacts on recruitment, or any variable there.
Sure.
Make them less aware, make them more susceptible to disease, make them less able to digest food, whatever it is. But we don't see the acute level of mortality that we would expect to see if it was a major driver.
So basically, let me just dumb it down as best I can for
I'm
myself,
sorry.
right? Because he woof over my head, but not really. So bird's going to eat a kernel of corn. It's not just going to fall over and die. Let's just leave it there, okay? It's that simple. But long term, there could be some impacts
Correct.
with other cumulative effects, maybe in the environment, you name it.
Yes.
And it could be impactful. And so if you really care about your birds, maybe we ought to consider some other things to do to best manage. If we're going to feed, maybe we just don't use corn. If you're like, I need some supplemental feed for my birds, maybe we think about using something else, okay? Another type of food that may be very good for birds. Like,
Sure.
Like if we're going to do sorghum or maybe sunflower seed, whatever that may be.
Yeah.
But we may also want to think about not throwing it in a feeder, because the other thing is we congregate a lot of critters at one spot. The incidence for disease goes through the roof.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, if one of them may happen to have a disease and they're touching heads and bumping in the same trough, now we're going to have problems. So a means to get around some of these things is considering if, hey, we're concerned about the birds. Maybe it's a harsh winter. Maybe it's a time where, you can tell your birds need a little lift. Maybe we had a complete failure in the mass crop where you are and you're just wanting to put a little something out. Consider putting it into good habitat, right? Consider putting some of that seed into good habitat as supplemental feed if you think you want to do that.
Yeah.
That could be an alternative to going out and putting it in a feeder in one spot and congregating critters onto that one spot each day.
And I would suggest for anybody that's interested, the time that something like aflatoxin becomes most potent is when it's hot and wet, right? It's summer, and in the South at least, okay? We don't need any supplementation.
What you mean in the summer we don't need more food?
In that period, because the poults are not going to select corn as a foraging thing because poults are not looking for items that sit still and are yellow on the ground. They're chasing mobile insects, high protein type of things. So
Learn behavior.
Yeah. So you know, even if you've got corn out there, it's probably not going to impact your young. They're not going to be eating it because of what they're actually searching for. So the utility of having any sort of supplemental feeding for turkeys on the landscape from April until August or September is probably none. It's probably very, very low at best.
Absolutely.
And that's actually when you'd expect the worst potential impacts of aflatoxin. And there's probably someone out there that says aflatoxin professionally and is going to yell at me about this, but you know, if I misstated anything, I'm sorry, but it's what the turkey literature says. It doesn't seem to me like it's something we need to worry about from a foraging perspective. Although, as a scientist, there could be cumulative effects that would need to be actually fully tested out with adult wild birds in a situation where you can actually, treat them experimentally and see what the response is.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think this whole feeding arena, if we look at how we're managing turkeys on a landscape or your property, if we're managing the habitat really well, you don't have to worry about really any of this because there's going to be some kind of food out there year-round for them.
Yep.
And that's usually not the limiting factor to have a better turkey population. However, when done incorrectly, it can cause issues. So not only that, but we're talking about some disease things, aflatoxins. But when we congregate birds to one spot, and I'm going to tell y'all right now, birds are kind of stupid. I mean, I'm just going to tell you.
Except when we're trying to catch them to do science on them.
Until we're trying to hunt one, right? That gobbler gets away. But I'll tell you right now, they come back to the feeder. And so let's say Fred comes to the feeder that day, and Mr. Hawk or Mr. Owl comes down, smacks him, he's gone. Well, they kind of go away, and they're like, well, Fred's gone, but I'm going to go back the next day. And then Joe dies. And then the next day, Brett dies. And for whatever reason, they keep coming back to the same spot, and they keep getting picked off. And so these are really just what I call death traps. When you congregate everything in one spot, all these predators out there, they figure out that, hey, the turkey's going to be there, and we like eating turkeys. And all of a sudden, they get picked off. It's a big sink.
It creates what's called an ecological sink on the landscape, where organisms, where predator efficiency, the rate at which a critter can predate stuff goes way up because there's an aggregation of things that it wants to eat for a reason. And sinks are bad, just like generally speaking. But with turkey populations in the eastern United States generally declining across their range. Generally, big hand wavy. They're not declining everywhere, but they are definitely in the southeast. Anytime you can avoid a sink for this bird is that's what we want to do.
Absolutely. What we're trying to do is give everyone the tools to best manage your wild turkey populations because we're concerned. I mean, I'm concerned. I don't hear as many birds that I used to in all the places I hunt, and that bothers me. And so anything we can do to make sure we don't have a silent spring, and you'll hear me say that a lot, that really concerns me.
Rachel Carson would be quite impressed.
I know she would.
Silent spring.
I have evolved it to something better because it's about turkeys. So it's a good thing. Right. But as we think about these things, not only these, if we're putting feed in one spot and we're attracting predators, but we're also attracting critters that are eating a lot of that food that may not be the food that the birds can even get to anymore, right? So, for example, let's say you have a few raccoons in your area and you got a big feeder of corn. How many raccoons do you think are going to be on that corn feeder?
All the raccoons will be hanging off of the corn feeder. Yeah, we all have the trail camera pictures.
And then we artificially increase the number of the critters that we don't want there because we don't want raccoons when we're trying to grow turkeys or other critters. We're not trying to feed other wildlife. We're trying to be focused. So these are just some helpful hints and things to think about when you're doing it. Consider using a different kind of feed if you're going to use it, number one. Number two, if you're going to use it, try to put it into quality habitat. Good cover so birds can peck around, find it, and they're basically safe and protected from all your aerial and mammalian predators.
Anytime you create a bucket of corn on the ground somewhere on the landscape, you're going to draw all kinds of stuff you don't want in.
Absolutely. And you're not congregating everything where you increase disease incidence. So if you can keep those things in mind, I think you're going to be very good when you're considering what else can I do to help a wild turkey.